So welcome and thank you for coming to this moderated panel to discuss Georgia State Bill 315. So if you're unfamiliar with the bill, the entire bill is there on the screen, all 41 lines, or 43 lines in all its glory. So just a little bit of background on the law itself. 2008 Georgia legislature introduced State Bill 315 to address the fact that as of today, that the state of Georgia has no law in place criminalizing hacking unless a crime reaches the threshold required to prosecute at the federal level. Then actually no action can be taken against the criminal for those hacking activities in Georgia, and that's loosely true, right? We can still prosecute them under, the traditional crimes if those. Usually, the computer is also being involved in some type of other crime like fraud or something like that. But I personally have been affected by this, where we've been seeing cases that perhaps didn't rise to the level of the federal, or that would require. Would receive the attention from the federal government, even though our local bureaus has been able to handle those anyway. But there probably is a need for some law here in Georgia that would do that. So the law was passed by the House of Representatives and the Senate, and then it was vetoed by our governor at the last minute. But there's been some speculation that they will reintroduce some similar legislature in the upcoming sessions of Congress. So we've brought together an all-star panel to discuss this and just talk about the problems of the law, how we could do this better moving forward, and the things that we should look out for as a community. So in alphabetical order, let me introduce to you first, there on my far left, your right, Mr. Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels. Jack Daniels is the co-founder of Security BSides. So BSidesAugusta is just one of the BSides conferences that happens all over the world. Jack started the first BSide conference. He's a community builder, storyteller, technologist, security professional, and he works for Temple Security. He has over 20 years of experience in network and systems administration and security, and has worked in a variety of practitioner and management positions. Jack used to put letters after his name, but he let most of them fall off and feels better now. So please welcome Jack Daniels. Next in the middle is Representative Jody Lott. Jody Lott represents the citizens of District 122, which includes portions of Columbia County. She was elected into the House of Representatives in 2015. Born and raised in Maine, Representative Lott graduated from the University of Maine with a nursing degree. She spent 18 years as a registered nurse in both inpatient and outpatient facilities within the greater Augusta community. Wellness and physical therapy practice in Evans, Georgia. I think I skipped the line. Currently, Representative Lott and her husband Jason are the owners of Evans Rehabilitation and Wellness, a physical therapy practice in Evans, Georgia, where she continues to assist in administrative responsibilities. Representative Lott currently serves as the vice chairman of the Intragovernmental Coordination Committee and a member of the Health and Human Services, Juvenile Justice, and State Property Committees. Representative Lott and her husband Jason have two sons, Dalton, Colby, and live in Evans, Georgia. So help me in welcoming Representative Jody Lott. Next, second from the right, my right, your left here is Brian Osden. Brian Osden is the supervisory senior resident agent for the FBI. Brian Osden began his career as special agent of the FBI in 2013, where he was assigned to the Atlanta Division, Augusta Regency Agency, where he worked for a variety of criminal offenses to include violent crimes, major offenders, domestic terrorism, and cyber. He created the CSRA's Child Exploitation Task Force, which I understand doesn't actually do child exploitation. You go after people to do. Okay. Important clarification. The CSRA Child Exploitation Task Force to protect and rescue children from human trafficking. Right there on the bio. I should have read that. He was the agent in charge of operations in Guantanamo Bay for the last several years. He's a lieutenant colonel in the Air Force Reserves, and he has, on a side note, personally arrested bad guys who have broken into networks that I was responsible for. So I very much appreciate. Brian, please join me in welcoming Brian Austin. Okay. Next, second from the left, over here is Elizabeth Wharton. Who has the biggest fan club in the entire conference room. So Elizabeth is a technology-focused policy and transaction attorney specializing in the development, security, and scale of emerging technologies, including drones, smart cities, and autonomous vehicles. She is the vice president of strategy for Prevalion, thank you, a cybersecurity threat intelligence company, overseeing the development and implementation of legal, policy, and strategic partnerships. Prior to Prevalion, she was the senior assistant city attorney responsible for advising the Hartwell-Jackson Atlanta International Airport on technology policies and projects, and was part of the immediate instant response team for the city of Atlanta during the 2018 ransomware incident. Okay, so please join me in welcoming Ms. And last but certainly not least, here, directly to my left, is Mr. Jake Williams. Jake Williams is an information security professional with experience in offensive and defensive security operations. He founded Rendition InfoSec, right here in Augusta, Georgia. He performs network security monitoring, forensics, incident response, and red team operations. Jake is also a senior instructor for the SANS Institute and an IANS faculty member. So please join me in welcoming Mr. Jake. So, panel, my first question really is there a need for the state of Georgia to have state legislation at all that criminalizes these types of activities? And if so, why does Georgia need to have some of its own legislation? So, who'd like to take that first?
Thank you, Mark. He gave us a heads up that he was going to hand the mic to me, so I did have a little bit of time to prepare for this particular question. From the federal side, I can simply say that we have a federal law. It's Title 18-1030. It's the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, and it's been in effect since the 80s. It's not used a lot here in Augusta, but I'll give you an example of a case that we worked here, and I'll tell you why I'm giving that as an example after I tell you just a little bit about it. So, an employee of a company, actually a couple of employees of a company, they decided they were going to go out on their own and start their own similar company. Their upper management realized this is a smaller mom and pop, but a decent sized business, a few $1 million in revenue. They just determined that they knew these individuals are going to go and start their own business, so they terminated them. Upon exit, it's a husband and wife combination. One of the individuals, the wife, had access to the credentials of all the employees to get into the network. So a few weeks after they were terminated, these two individuals were able to log in to some of the accounts, particularly the email accounts of the folks that they had, the company they had left. And the reason they were doing so, as we determined, was to take proprietary information, in particular some bids on some contracts that they were working on for some local companies. They then used that information, underbid the company, and then were able to get the bids themselves for their new company. Well, obviously this poses an issue for the company that they left. I mean, if you're stealing all the proprietary bid information and all the pricing schedules for a competitor, it gives you a pretty big advantage. So we were able to go in, we determined through IP addresses that they had logged in to this, their former employee. We were able to do a couple search warrants and subsequently got the individuals to plead with information, which in our world is counter to an indictment, they were convicted, arrested, and are serving time. But the reason I bring this case to an example is because if this case had happened in Atlanta, the federal government would have never touched it. The loss was, $40,000, which in Augusta, because we have a close relationship with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the community, that can make an impact. It was actually the first of that particular act, and I've been in the Bureau since 2003. That was not 2013. But this case was like 2007. It was the first time we had used that particular act as a case. So we wanted to demonstrate that it was effective. But in Atlanta, that would have never happened. So ultimately, if we punted that to the state system, there would not have been a comparable criminal law to charge them with. Now, we also use wire fraud and some of the other, there are some other federal laws not specifically for computers that maybe the state system could use, but having a very specific cyber computer intrusion hacking law is beneficial, and I hope that's a good example to show why we need one in Georgia.
Just as a follow-up, how much damage would you say is typically required before it's going to garner the attention of law enforcement in, say, Atlanta?
So that varies by district. We're in the Southern District of Georgia. We've got a very aggressive U.S. Attorney's Office, and there's a few factors that play into that. And one is the deterrent factor. It can be very limited damage, but if it's a deterrent, if it's wide-reaching, and there's a way to set an example so that we can show the community that we won't tolerate that, then that number could be very low. The thresholds are, the minimum is 5,000, but the federal government, I've presented cases to the Northern District, which is Atlanta, for upwards of, in fact, some of my colleagues here, we presented one for $2 million in Atlanta and they declined it. So it just kind of depends on where you are, but I can tell you that the case we worked down here, that one I just shared with you, would have never been addressed. And they just have too many cases to deal with $40,000. And we got creative. We started trying to add in the cost of redoing their security network, to try to make the loss bigger, but still in a bigger jurisdiction, especially like look at New York or DC. They would never touch a $40,000 case. Atlanta wouldn't either. Yes, sir.
Well, you mentioned the deterrent factor. Could you tell us what that means exactly?
To try to set an example, so if the community. In cyber, to basically motivate people not to commit the same crime. So if it, maybe it's a $40,000 loss, but if there can be a media splash about it and the general public says, if I do this, I'm going to get 5 years in jail. Most people don't want to go to jail for any number of years, but certainly the type of crime that the federal government gives you, especially considering we have no parole, so you do a majority of your time. That has a deterring effect on the community. That was one reason why this particular case I just shared with you, because we hadn't used that act before, it was a way to demonstrate to the community that, hey, there is a cyber law in the federal government, and we are able to use it if we want to. So I don't know in this particular case if that had a deterring effect to the people that might have potentially committed these kind of crimes, but we certainly had that intent.
So just one more follow-up. So if in the case of the $2 million in loss and the FBI Atlanta says, no, we're not going to take this case, if you are a resident of the state of Georgia, is there some other recourse that you have, or does the fact that there is no Georgia state law mean that you are just now out of luck?
So, yes, and in that particular case, it ended up being prosecuted by, the case was multiple jurisdictions, so it ended up getting prosecuted in DC, and the $2 million that was involved in Georgia was rolled up into that particular case. So there are some, but that's not always the case. This hadn't been a large enough case where there was other victims in other jurisdictions. And the reason why we actually brought it to the attention, because one of the victims was actually in Augusta, so we thought maybe, it was maybe $100 out of $2 million. We thought maybe we could do something with it, but it was just too complex. But if that doesn't exist, if the only law, now I'm not saying, I can't speak for the Northern District of Georgia, and I don't know what their thresholds are. I can just talk about that particular incident. But, I can tell you that $40,000 would never be prosecuted in Atlanta. That's well below their thresholds. And frankly, ours for fraud cases are $1 million. But because we have a close relationship, we can sometimes go well below that. Atlanta, because it's a bigger jurisdiction, they're not able to have some of that variance that we have down
ask a follow-up here? Okay. So I'm curious, can you talk about a case maybe where you basically give an example of a crime here in Georgia where the lack of this type of law prevents the actual prosecution of a crime? Do you have any examples of those? Because that's what we heard pressed a lot, here, was that the lack of this prevents us from prosecuting crime. I'm curious what your take on it is, given your experience.
And again, it's hard because Augusta has such a great relationship. But we have, we're in a small community, small office, so we're able to take a lot of. I can actually give you one example of just that. There was some defacement of a website that it actually was Mark's Mark's company. Potentially, we could have prosecuted the individuals, but because the complexity and there was really no financial damage at all. It ended up just we cleaned it up, we brought it to his attention, he cleaned it up and it went away, which is not, obviously you want to put people in jail when they commit a crime. In this case, now if there had been a state law, maybe we could have punted it to our state folks, and we have, I know that the DA's office in Augusta is very aggressive, so they very likely could have, but in this particular case, we just focused on detection and then stopping it.
So, Elizabeth, you have some?
Yeah, well, and one thing to keep in mind too is we do have computer trespass. So we have OCGA 16993 for any other fellow law nerds, that when unauthorized access go in and in the case you were describing, accessing someone's network without authorization and take some data, take some information from them, that you have violated the statute, and it has both civil as well as criminal penalties. So that gets us into that sticky widget, though, of just because we have a shiny object, do we have an existing framework? And part of the motivation behind where SB 315 came from the elections database, and so in that case, no information was taken. No, they didn't really, they went in, identified the vulnerabilities, but because there was not that further step, that they didn't impact, that's the gaping hole that the Attorney General's office was looking to fill.
So, for those who don't know, there was a particular case that drew the attention of some legislatures that did this. Can anyone share any of the details of what that particular case was? Does anybody want to?
I'd like to say thank you for letting me be here today. I can barely turn my own computer on, so I will not be giving you any technical information. But basically, this SB 315 was considered a snooping bill, something that we didn't have addressed in code. And I know that Elizabeth just said that we do have some trespass language in code if you move anything, if you shift anything, and actually even if you use data to your advantage. So we do have a code that kind of follows some of that, but I don't know all of the Attorney General's levels of which they can do things. But this became the snooping bill, which was we have an elections database at a university system in Georgia, and it was maintained by the university system, and it was a database that was used by pollsters. Who are the Republicans? Who are the Democrats? What doors do we knock on? And it was not actually officially our elections, our Secretary of State's office, but it was a database of elections information. And someone went into that and found the vulnerability in that system and brought it to the attention of the university system. And then, needless to say, things are not always handled properly in government situations, and we certainly did not handle that properly at the time that the information was brought forward. But once it was all discovered that somebody had made their way in, had snooped, not moved anything, not touched anything, not done any harm except they brought it forward. And once it was figured out, of course, now we have made some significant cyber changes, and we certainly outsource a lot of our stuff now that we didn't before, so it helped us. But then they took offense. So then, as a government, we took offense. We developed SB 315, and we wrote this legislation, and it was very, very, very broad. And then we'll get into that on further questions. But that's basically the Kennesaw State University elections happening. snooping incident.
So, thank you. So as you mentioned, so SB 315 was pretty widely criticized as criminalizing a lot of legitimate and necessary research, as well as legalizing quote unquote hacking back, right? So that was another one of the criticisms of the law, is that it encouraged or legalized hacking back. So can any of our panelists help us to understand the flaws in the legislation that led to its eventual veto by Governor Nathan Deal?
I'm happy to take part of that at least. So I'm not going to cover everything here by any stretch, but real quick, I would mention that the Atlanta ransomware incident that Ms. Wharton was involved in there, at least on the legal end.
Involved in the remediation?
Involved in the remediation, yes.
Because any relationship with the folks holding the information hostage, I did not see any of the Bitcoin that was not paid.
Yeah. This is kind of like when I have to admit that I used to work at HP Geary when they were breached, right? That's never a fun time either. You have to caveat I wasn't in charge of security, right? But as we talk about the Atlanta ransomware event, one of the things that came out immediately after they got hit was that they had big public relations and PR teams coming out and explaining how they have great cybersecurity in the city of Atlanta, right? That's what they do, and everybody gets hit, and it was just an opportune thing for them. But it turns out that we have scan data. If you remember the shadow brokers incidents, when they dumped a lot of tools, we have scan data going back where Rendition InfoSec was scanning the whole internet. And we were actively interrogating machines that were open on port 445. For those that don't know, that's Windows file sharing, which is a really bad idea to have that publicly exposed to the internet. And it turns out that some of those tools that were leaked, you can tell whether or not machines have been exploited by interrogating those machines. And by questioning those machines without actually accessing, how does access work? I don't know. Actually, that's a Liz question. But how does access work? What's the legal definition there? But we were questioning those machines without directly compromising them and identifying those that were compromised. And so we're able to provide a useful, I feel like, useful data point back to the community to say that a year before, 5 of these machines, definitely 5 of the servers in the city of Atlanta, had, and again, this is a minimum number, had been compromised, right? And so this kind of throws in the face of, or flies in the face of, yes, we definitely take cybersecurity seriously when you can show that these machines that were publicly exposed to the internet had been unpatched for months, right? So anyway.
The point there being that
that would be illegal under SB
the research there that you did would be illegal under SB 315.
Yeah, I apologize here. I forgot the overtone, right? The research there would be 100% illegal under SB 315. We would not have been able to conduct that research. That would have been criminalized under the Act.
Yeah. So the version that we see up here is the version that was passed. If you go back and look at what was first introduced, you see how the one up above us has all these kind of carve-outs, legitimate business purpose, under the terms of service, and even the whole hacking back, the ability to. In the initial version as introduced, none. It was the intentionally accessing without authorization. So as the bills evolve through, and this is absolutely Jody's wheelhouse and what you'll get for good, but it's part of one, it speaks to the community reached out and said, hey, we've got some issues with this. They were receptive, worked some of that in, but to look at this and the flaws within the legislation as it is, it's still light years better than it was. And there's still that much further to go. So it's kind of that important part. But speaking to the actual legislation in its path.
This is my great opportunity to tell you, you should know your representatives. But I know nothing about cyber. This is an SB bill, meaning it starts in the Senate. And I am in the House. I would not have seen this bill for an additional 12 working days had it not been from an email from Mr. Mark Baggett, and it was a first phone call and then an email that went in to say, hey, there's been a bill that's been passed in the Senate, the bad version, I should say the worst version. was actually passed out of the Senate in that form where there were no exemptions. It was unauthorized use. Well, so at that point, the phone call and the message from Mark to me was, what can we do about this legislation? I need you to basically, I need you to find it, stop it, help it, fix it.
I want to go to jail.
Agreements, what is it, what do you call this? Agreements on the computer when you're, just terms of service, thank you. I mean, none of that was excluded from what we were looking at. So everybody, pretty much anybody, and in your email to me, it clearly stated, if you have a fake name on Facebook, you're done. You know, I mean, he just went through this long list. So, you know, he had this opportunity. We'd never met before that. But I just want you to know that that's how these kind of things evolve. And we did make some changes, and we did make some significant changes to the legislation. It was still just a 2-page bill. Most of the bills in Georgia, and I know that you're not all from Georgia, but most every bill is less than 6 pages long. When I do get a phone call or an email, it means a lot to me if you've actually read the legislation before you tell me what's wrong with it. And so we were here, and this is where he met me right in the middle, and we fought through this battle. Plenty of reasons why this bill from the Senate was not going to work. We have research institutions, as you can imagine, but he pointed all of this out. So we went ahead and scurried, but I would like to say that your entire organizations, all of the cyber grouping and technical people, there were a lot of folks sort of hitting the governor's office and hitting the House and the Senate and coming forward with similar information, but we were able to take this bill and sort of adjust it. That didn't make it perfect, but we'd certainly go on.
Along those lines, let me point out Scott Jones with the EFF, who's right here in the front. Scott's organization did a lot in lobbying with legislators.
Whenever you get time, I'll say a little pitch if you want me to.
Okay.
I can tell you a little more.
All right, or you want to do it now?
We can do it.
Is the question here of what kind of impact this is going to have on the community, why this is a bad bill? Is this the right time?
Well, probably the best way to go
Okay.
back and look at everything is to look at our website, ef-georgia.org, where we did the full analysis. And so,
yeah, I've went to Electronic Frontiers Georgia. We started back in the 1990s, and one of the co-founders is also here. And so, yeah, we did a full analysis of the bill, and it's on our website, ef-georgia.org, if you look for SB 315. I think that the hackback was very concerning for a lot of people. But as you said, this bill, as was said already, the bill went through many stages and had many problems. The very early draft of the bill actually had a property forfeiture clause, which was extremely broad, and it was extremely scary. So,
whatever equipment had been used to do the research would have been snatched up as part of the investigation and resulting.
But I mean, the way it was written, if you plugged your computer into the house power, then they could take your house because your house provided power for the computer that's used for the hack. So it was bad.
And kind of building further, EF Georgia going to and reaching out to all of the different technology, information security organizations, learning as much as you can and figuring out how you can help the effort. Because unfortunately, where I was sitting at the time, the city of Atlanta, we didn't have an official position on the legislation. So as an employee within the law department, I could not say a thing. But if people happen to reach out to me, I could give them, hey, I see you're very interested in this bill. May I share with you a chief of staff or the staffer here's their email address, phone number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Here's how to reach them. Send them a very well-written letter if you need some help on that. Go to EF Georgia, look at what they're doing, look at what others. So getting involved in that plays a significant role in getting stuff changed because legislators can't know everything about the nuanced subjects, and so what sounds like a great idea, we can't, oh, you shouldn't be able to have unauthorized access, that's bad, and when they can point to things, but then to be able to walk it back and say, but the reason the database is now more secure, and the reason is because researchers found the vulnerabilities and disclosed them and to the proper contact. So when we have all the stuff about oh, responsible disclosure, bug bounties, everything, to know that just even that research, if you stumbled upon it, would trip you up under state law is just scary.
First, I have to twitch because you said responsible disclosure,
Oh,
and we
yes.
do not use that term. Responsible is a word that's been used against researchers
Sure.
by vendors. A couple of things, we've talked about authorized access, and here's where this can't be vague. I can go to your website, so I've accessed your website, but I can't go to the page with your costs of materials behind your catalog because I have to log in first. But if you misconfigure it and I click a link and accidentally land somewhere where you say I can't go, I was authorized on a computer level, but you say I'm not allowed to go there. This is one of those things where, and this is the challenge with this Computer Fraud and Abuse Act, CFAA is not especially clear either. And so one of the reasons I think a lot of us get really wound up about this is like, hey, if Georgia's going to have a bill, it should actually solve some of those problems, and it should be a tool that's useful for small businesses to defend themselves. It should be a tool that's useful. It should be a tool that doesn't leave law enforcement wondering how hard they should work and then doing an enormous amount of work and watching it go thud. On the other hand, it shouldn't have curious high school kids with felony charges, ruining the rest of their lives. So simple things like we've talked about authorized access. What exactly does that mean? Does that mean what you think is authorized, or does that mean what the logic the logic flaws in your computer system make for access? And so it's vagueness in this is not good. I often joke that so CFAA first person convicted was Robert Tappan Morris, possibly the last person legitimately convicted. That's not fair to say, but so it's a real issue. But as far as not being able to bring the law, when I do history talks, one of the people I talk about are two French brothers who subverted the French semaphore system long before electronics by bribing somebody to put signals on, and they realized they were playing these market scams. They would find out when the fish were landing, they would just beat the market to death. And so they defrauded hundreds of thousands of dollars 150, 180 years ago. And so they were arrested, and they looked on the books, and there was no law. And so they're like, oh, well, keep all your money and good luck. So if people are doing bad things, it needs to be illegal. We need to understand what it is.
If I could follow up with Jack Daniels, and I have to admit, I've always kind of wanted to say that. I agree. CFAA is not. It's not a perfect act. It's got a lot of loopholes, and many a good defense attorney has been able to mitigate their clients because of some of the loopholes. But the intent is there's really 5 categories, and I wrote them down so I wouldn't miss them. That really was the intent of the law, and it's data that's related to national security. That's a no-no. You can't just go in and access that, whether you're doing legitimate research or not. If it's a top secret database, you're not supposed to be in there. Financial records belonging to financial institutions, including credit card issuers, that can be prosecuted under this law. If you have the intent to defraud, obviously if your intentions are negative and bad, then you can be prosecuted under the law. Information that belongs to any U.S. government, department, or agency, again, that kind of caveats with the national security, but if it's something that belongs to a government agency, you can't tap into the FBI's website and dig into it, or some of our secure networks. Even if you're not trying to do anything bad, that's still considered a violation of the law. And then if it relates to interstate communications or commerce, and that's where I think you have a lot of gray area that probably Mr. Daniels was discussing. There is some gray area in that one, and that's probably where most people end up with the defense. Yes, sir.
I have a 2-part question. The first part is, how do you determine legitimate research from somebody who wants to break in, steal the information, and then later on claiming they thought they were doing legitimate research? And secondly, I heard that the EFF and several people on the board keep referring to this as a hackback bill, but I can't find the word hack or back anywhere in the bill. And they seem to have mentioned Computer Security Act of Defense. Where did the hackback moniker come from?
You want to take that? I'll talk about the research thing, right? I think it's really, really difficult to tell at a technical level to differentiate legitimate research from what looks like computer crime otherwise. I'm going to come back to the to the example because I don't want to implicate myself in other potential crimes. I'm going to come back to the scanning the internet for the stuff compromised by Eternal Blue. That looks just like exploiting stuff. And trying to access those back doors, right? So the only difference is I stop immediately before, but for all you know, we actually saw, I should say for all you know, we observed, with some of our internet sensors, people doing that first, and then coming back from the same IP addresses and dropping malware later, in a period, in some cases, of 1 to 1 hour to a couple of days. So certainly that's not outside the realm of possibilities, and that makes it very difficult to differentiate. I think the law enforcement folks will speak to intent, but at a technical level, it's very, very difficult for you to step back and say, here's precisely where the line between research and obviously there's some obvious, when you cross the line, you're doing damage or whatever, but you interrogating a system could indeed take that system down, in which case you denied access to the system. Well, now we strayed into, now we have committed a criminal act while doing research, again, at least under the law.
Let me just ask a question of the audience here, just to kind of understand the gray area. So if you run an Nmap scan against a company's IP range, if you would say that is legal, raise your hand.
Is or should be?
Is. Is. An Nmap scan against a company's IP address
Going
is
back,
legal?
what's the intent?
What kind of scan?
Yeah, well,
okay.
So,
Okay.
dash A?
Yeah, with a dash capital A option on your Nmap scan. And all the hands go down? No?
It is legal, right? Yeah. According to current laws. Yeah.
Well, so what if the command line option with the dash A includes doing password guess, runs the default Nmap scripts and does the password guessing against the SSH servers that it finds, and the FTP servers? Is that
Where are we running it from?
From your house. I thought you said we were running from your house.
Which one and which VPN endpoint at the other end is it?
Yep,
So the problem is that the term intent is subjective and obscure. You can, how do you determine intent? The reason Hillary Clinton didn't get in trouble because of something bad.
I mean, intent is there a victim? So I can give you another example of a case, and this was from Mark as well. Somebody breaks into a corporation and then tries to sell what they found to that company,
right,
and caused damage by doing what he did. So that is clearly his intent was not just righteousness.
Right, but if you catch them in the act,
which we did.
They haven't done anything with it. They haven't gotten the data. They haven't done anything with the data. So that's the.
So I can tell you from that exact scenario, we caught him in the act, and then we did some research back, and the same individual had done the same thing against actually this same university, and also tried to sell back what he had. So and we had every intention of prosecuting this particular individual. Unfortunately, he passed away prior to it coming to fruition, but we were intending on prosecuting him because historical data, case closed.
I would say that the law is intentionally vague.
The moral of the story is don't mess with Mark.
And that's, you highlighted in your other example as well, when you leave kind of the gray areas, or when the legislatures leave those gray areas in the bills or in what becomes the statute, it gives a lot of discretion to the prosecutors. And that's part of the problem of even discussing SB 315. It was like, oh, well, we won't do that.
Yes.
Really?
Until you embarrass an important politician, then they will prosecute.
Or, there's any number, or somebody's having a bad day, and we have some amazing people that are working in law enforcement, et cetera, and they have a tough task, but personalities are personalities and staffs are staffs. You just don't know. And so from putting on my legal hat, and when researchers for the companies I work with or work for would come and say, hey, can we do this? I'm like, well, all right, have you put anything in writing yet? Can it pass the giggle test? Can you give me enough information to where I could go stand in front of someone and with a straight face make an argument in your behalf? If I can't do that, then no, we can't do it. Even though it might be really cool research and it might be, does it pass the giggle test? Have you put something in writing you shouldn't have, or are you documenting your intent with this? Have you documented the relationship if there is one? But that's the trouble with the gray areas. I mean, even looking at the section on active defense, well, okay, and the legitimate business purpose, it's not legitimate business purpose because nobody's paid me yet, but if I'm found some really cool research and I use it to get a job, do I have to wait to disclose it after I've been hired and then go show that I was doing it for job hunting purposes or school, or I got nothing.
So did anybody have a good why it's a hackback other than Jim on?
It's the phrase active defense, right? That's what we're.
Yeah, I'd like that.
And that's utterly undefined. Active defense can be a script that blocks an IP address if it hits your firewall too many times, and we're just going to drop all that traffic. Or active defense, does that mean I'm going to RF all the boxes that are hitting me? Which was problematic when Akamai controls a third of the internet.
Yeah, okay, so the hackback clause is indeed the line 18 Cybersecurity Act of Defense. I am not a lawyer, but I did some research on this, and it turns out that the hot phrase Cybersecurity Act of Defense has no specific legal meaning based on my research. So that means that judges and juries can construe it to mean whatever they want it to mean based on how it's being cast by a prosecutor. So it could be read as hackback, but the problem with hackback legislation is what about false flag? There's many other problems, but that's part of the problem. What if you set up somebody to look like a bad guy, that would be false flag. But it is line 18, and doing the research on it, I found out that it does have no specific legal meaning.
Okay, so law is horribly flawed. Is there a consensus here on this? So, all right. So, and there is a need for to protect legitimate researchers from this type of legislation. So, can maybe share either personal anecdotes or examples of how criminalizing this would have adversely affected customers? So, if this law had passed, right, then really what's the worst going to happen, right? It's just another law. Let's talk about
You're talking about legitimate research, but let's talk about another edge case, completely made up, no basis in reality at all. Imagine that you live in a small town, perhaps in Georgia, and your water bill comes and it says you can pay online, and you go online and they use a third-party portal, and you put in your username and password, and your username and account number appear in the URL bar. And those of us that have been in this business for a while have a real urge to change things in that. Because thankfully nobody does direct object reference stupidity on the web. Can I, in this completely theoretical situation where I drive to the water department and hand them a paper check every month because I don't trust them? Oh wait, maybe not theoretical. What do? It's under an extreme interpretation of this stuff. I can't even tell the people at the water department. Now, there's a whole other problem, which is when I do tell the people at the water department, they're people at the water department. They're not people that understand web security, much less cybersecurity and SB 315 and the alternatives. And so I've just stumbled across something that is at best a poor practice, and at worst lets me, see everybody's bills and possibly I don't know how far you can go because I'm not about to dig into that rabbit hole, but anybody that's played it with one of these websites that's, whether a pen test or testing your own systems, knows that sometimes that little thing opens up just utter nightmares. So what do you do? There's like, I would be afraid to, if this passed, I would be afraid to report it, because first of all, I don't know where I would go, but I would have to go up to the company that does it for a bunch of small towns, and they're probably going to respond like companies do. So, there are all these challenges. So it's like, oh, hey, I stumbled across something. It's a bad practice, maybe, whatever. And this gets into a lot of historical cases around the world. Okay, I changed the last digit of the number and I see somebody else's account. Okay, if I stop there, then I have a pretty strong case in my own mind. Maybe not a prosecutor who wants to be DA and eventually run for president. Right? But is that over the line? Is 2 or 3 over the line? A lot of the stories that, to flip to the law enforcement side, a lot of these, somebody found this kind of problem and they're being prosecuted. What doesn't come out is they downloaded the entire database. They wrote a script and pulled it all. But where does that line go? Where can, this can keep me from saying, you need to fix stuff. And that's not even intentionally going out looking for it. Those of us in this field, if you pay attention, you see really bad stuff all the time. And this would keep me from reporting. As it is, I always think about whether or not it's an organization that's likely to respond well to being told they screwed up.
So what about the opposite of that, where someone has a problem with the water department? They found a problem, and the first call is to Brian Press to try to embarrass them, and are now publishing all the instruments and passwords. So what's the flip side to that? How do you tell the intent of the person's actions based solely on what they do?
So in legal terms, that's called burden of proof, right?
Yep.
You would have to, the prosecutor owns the burden of proof to prove that if there was an intent and the person should have known that it was unauthorized.
I'll throw out another hypothetical example. A hypothetical 11-year-old that may or may not belong to me may or may not have found a command injection vulnerability in a school website, or school third-party website that her school uses that may or may not have allowed her to gain access to lots of other students' information, not just the students, but also their parents. And she may or may not have come home and bragged to me that she had discovered this. Right now, a lot of people, at least when I had a daughter initially, when I had a daughter initially, I was worried about having the talk, and I had no idea what the talk was going to mean in 2018 terms. But this is a great example where if and she wasn't actively pen testing as an 11-year-old, right? But she works with me sometimes and has seen some of the, hey, throw a semicolon in here and let's see what we can do, and got some data back. And all of a sudden now we're kind of, we're stepping foot into the active hacking whatever, right? Was she wrong for doing it? Wrong for hypothetically doing this, completely hypothetical scenario, allegedly doing this. Yes, no question about that, right? I think we can go and level that right now. But kids being kids and her not intending to do anything other than say, hey, is the security on this thing that has my information in it, kind of coming back to Jack's example, is the security of this thing that has my information in it, is it well put together? And we were able hypothetically to disclose to this company that hypothetically Columbia County and Richmond County both use as well, and all our kids are safer for it, right? But under SB 315, I wouldn't touch that. Right, so if SB 315 were law, there's no question that we started that computer trespass, as it were, in one of the counties in Georgia. So I guess that's a good example, for me at least, hypothetical example of a place where that would have mattered.
Brian, you want to talk about this one here? With
it's a good example for one simple reason.
Minor, brother.
We don't have, the federal system doesn't have a juvenile. We have no juvenile system. So if she was 18 or 19 and actually did commit a crime, there would need to be some kind of state law to be able to prosecute her. I'm still going to get that information.
You
should put her on a watch list. She's freaking dangerous. Right?
So, one more example of something that I had very recently. So, prominent information security researcher came to Augusta, was doing a demonstration of some awesome things you could do with software-defined radio systems, right? And it's just got a software-defined radio system plugged into the laptop and is tuning around, and suddenly on the screen starts flowing some HIPAA type information of patient being checked into emergency room, name, date of birth, social security number, checked into emergency room, diagnostic codes of patients being transmitted in clear text, wireless SDR radio, so I can go on the internet, 5 minutes of searching YouTube videos, and reproduce this in a couple of minutes, right? Looking at this information. So what do you do with that? Well, under SB 315, even without SB 315, it's like, well, is this a violation of wiretap laws? Is what just happened here, is doing what this YouTube video walks you through, is it legal? Right? It's just, the problem is with many of the laws, right? You can read the law and see what it says, but then it's also gone through court, and there's case law on top of courts, right? We had San Francisco, the 19th District Court look at our wiretap laws and say that wireless connections are no longer radio transmissions, right? That we're not using radio frequencies once you have established a Wi-Fi connection, it's no longer a radio communication, right? Well, that is complete nonsense, right, to anyone who has any type of understanding of radio frequencies. So for us to even understand whether or not something is legal or not requires both a law degree and a complete understanding of all the case law that leads up to these things. As researchers, it's just too dangerous to do anything. So are we scared into a position where we can no longer do legitimate research to find vulnerabilities? By the way, last Saturday, found a buffer overflow, Microsoft PowerShell version 5. Looking forward to completely understanding that and going through an irresponsible disclosure. Coordinated disclosure process and getting that bug fixed and making it safer for everybody. So are we scared into a place where we can't do legitimate research and make things better for people?
Or what happens if you're watching some botnet that's crashing down everything, and say you sinkhole some of the traffic because, well, it stops what's going on, it keeps the world in traffic, but you didn't have permission to take over that data. I mean, you just happen to know you hadn't registered one of the domains, or you do something like that hypothetically, and yeah, you save the world billions of dollars of damage, but it's not a legitimate business purpose, and it wasn't necessarily an active defense because we're not sure what that is. And so, hey, thanks for stopping the world from burning, but we're going to send you to jail. Or I've had clients in the past who may or may not have purchased a automobile beginning with a T, and noticed it had certain similarities, software, and done testing on that, and played around with stuff, and they're goofing around. They had no malicious intent. They had not a legitimate business purpose. They're a creative mind. It's sitting in their driveway, and they don't mind if they mess it up. Have they similarly triggered something under this outside of CFA worries? What happened?
Just quickly, I want to point out the hacker perspective here. We're talking about what we're doing to researchers or just obvious, curious people. What's not getting addressed in SB 315 is those who are negligent with our data, those who violate HIPAA and other laws and fail to protect our data, They're getting away free if we can't hold them accountable. We don't have the tools, something that'd be great in Georgia is we could put some teeth into our breach disclosure law. I had a credit card reissued because of a merchant breach. Nobody's owned up to it. I have no way to find out. I can't force the credit card issuer to tell me who it was. They're indemnified. So we've got laws on the books that should help us as individuals against the corporations that aren't securing our data. They're not being used in a way that protects us. So not that I'm advocating vigilante, cyber, whatever, but we need the as Karen Alexander calls hackers, the internet immune system, is those of us who are curious and watch things, whether formally or informally, because that hospital wasn't doing what HIPAA requires them to do. The credit card merchant was not doing what Georgia law requires them to do in notifying me of the breach. So we have to remember there are other parties. It's why I object to the term responsible disclosure, because it's normally used by those businesses against those of us that do research by saying we're irresponsible when they are the ones that failed to secure things in the first place. And not that it's easy. There's an industry because this is hard. A lot of us make good money because it's hard to secure stuff. So it's a complex, it's a complex situation, and simple answers fail.
I see some questions out there. Can you take the microphone?
Yeah.
If kind of on a related topic, if I'm a business owner or say a software engineer and I'm building a product that has a touch point from the internet, legally, are there other statutes for, the example that I think in my mind is, let's say I own 100 acres of land and part of my property borders public land. If someone wanders onto my land and I don't have a fence up, is that person trespassing and can I prosecute? And then on the digital side of things, is there a standard or a burden on the provider of a service to secure their stuff that they have to meet that standard before they can prosecute? Not just someone who's trying to brute force a login, which is a little more easy to prove intent, but those cases where a researcher finds open vulnerabilities. I don't know if that's clear.
Yeah, so the question is somewhat, are there laws that do kind of go, what Jack is saying is enforcing, because I know we have things like Visa, MasterCard, PCI standards that are kind of corporate enforced, but does anybody know of legislation that is putting some teeth behind making corporations who have data responsible for the data they're holding? Is that some question?
There's GDPR, isn't there?
What's that?
GDPR?
There's GDPR that says you can't hold the data.
Sorry, I threw up my mouth.
I'm gonna get the airport wrong, but about a year ago, I think it was Heathrow, Bristol, one of the airports had a data breach in the sense of an employee had an unencrypted thumb drive that had a lot of information on it that was found, and they just received, the airport itself received a £120,000 fine. In the US, you have the FTC that should be doing more of that, perhaps. There's a fight between the different FTC, FCC, and where you're looking at who actually is going to, the FTC is in charge of consumer protection, but whether they have actually exercised that authority and put teeth behind it. Was reading something just this week on the SEC is looking at putting security and lax security practices as something. So you have government agencies that are doing it from a state level. It just depends on what the state statutes and if you've breached a duty that has been imposed. But as you see, it's going to take a lot heavier of a fine, or lawyers and insurers, we mess everything up. So either they get sued and it's heavy penalty or a fine than hit and run groups.
All right, so you had a question you would go to?
Yeah, so it seems like the same kind of argument we were having this morning about whitelisting versus blacklisting. Obviously, you guys said this is in reaction to bad stuff happening to Atlanta. Why don't we basically create, you know, a bill that's a whitelist of stuff that is okay, that is acceptable for, you know, Jake to do his job? Like, it seems like laws are all going to blacklist and tell you what you can't do. So what should be okay?
Right, so I think the question, I think the issue would be the same thing that there is with actual whitelisting. As if you try to implement application whitelisting, which is where you say, these are all the applications that we're allowed to do in our organization, well, what's the problem with that? It's that it's always changing, it's always evolving, right? The next day, okay, well, business needs change, I now have to do this. And it would be the same thing for hacking, right? Microsoft released a new tool, so there's a new technique that needs to be used to, or Microsoft releases a new product, there's a new tool that needs to be used to break into that system, so the techniques would never be evolving. So I would fear that if you had a whitelisting approach to the law, that would be good for a day.
And keep in mind, the Georgia legislature meets for 40 days. And so what happens if we created this whitelist, if they've worked with all the industry groups, and on the 50th day after the legislature had, Microsoft comes out with some, you know, and it evolves. You can't play catch up when it comes to technology policy. You can't chase the shiny object. You have to pull it back and say, okay, what was the harm? What was the end result? Because if you look at the mechanism through which folks are doing it, there's enough ODA out there and research that you're already behind.
I think your mic got turned on.
I'd actually like to hear Jack's opinion on this as well, but I'll tell you that if we had a whitelist approach, even assuming that everything stays static, and we don't have the constant change problem, I'm going to take that off the table for a minute. I would actually be less comfortable performing my job, because anything that wasn't explicitly in the whitelist, I'd be worried about doing now, versus right now, I've got a pretty clear understanding of at least stuff that's over the line, right? And I think we can all identify lots of gray area, but I know where the blacklist is at, right? If you come up with a whitelist, I'm suddenly fearful that, and again, I'm really interested to know Jack, given his experience, what you think about this, but I'd be more concerned with the whitelist, doing anything that wasn't on the whitelist now.
Okay, let me come back to questions at the end. I want to pose one last question to the group and give everybody a chance to respond, and then if we have some time, we'll come back to questions and answers from the group. But so the question is that, you know, there has been some discussion that in the 2019 General Assembly session that some people are going to reintroduce the law, right? There's an election coming up and things are going to change, perhaps in the makeup of the Senate and House. So, although we certainly hope that Jody Lott will still be there, she voted. But regardless of that, right? You know, what's going to happen in the next legislation? In the next legislature, and particularly, how is it that lawmakers can address the gray areas? Right? There is gray area. Right? We don't. Is it okay to go up and change the item on a URL? Right? There was a time when someone was arrested for that. Right? With Apple registration, and then later exonerated. Right? Is that right?
He wasn't exonerated.
Yeah, he wasn't exonerated. He was.
It was the wrong.
Procedural issue.
Procedural issue? Okay, so maybe just changing a URL is illegal, right? Nmap scanning, is that legal? Well, we don't know, right? None of us here know whether these things are legal. How do we address the gray area in the legislation and find the right balance between allowing researchers to do what's necessary to help us understand vulnerabilities and eliminate them from these products so that we are all more secure? And what do we need to do that? So I'm going to just, this battery's working, so we'll just pass this one all the way down the row, give each of you guys a chance to answer this question.
I'm going to be super short here because this isn't rocket science, right? We've had the gray areas in, and particularly interstate commerce is absolutely, it's it's laughable. Coming back to the laugh test or the giggle test, the idea of interstate commerce triggering, or any system that's involved in interstate commerce, show me an internet-connected server that's not involved in interstate commerce, right? I mean, seriously, that's where the giggle test lands for me. So I'm going to step back here and say that for this is fairly simple. We've been having the CFAA debate and the what's wrong with the CFAA for a long time now, and the idea that, you know, we went forward, or the Georgia legislature went forward and wrote a bill with many of the same ambiguities, but somehow worse, that doesn't pass the Google test to me. So I'd step back and say, hey, take a look at the arguments that have been put forth before and at least solve those at a state level rather than writing legislation that has all of the same problems and then adding more.
Sir?
And I would agree 100%. It all comes down to intent. I mean, if the intent is to do research and do good things, then obviously you shouldn't be criminalized for it. But if the intent is to defraud or to steal national security secrets, then of course you should be. So there needs to be some serious debate on that. And then I'll leave it to the experts in the House and the Senate to come up with a bill that meets that need. And on that.
Yeah, we certainly didn't prove to be experts on this one, did we?
Your nursing degree prepared you
Right.
well for this.
You prepared me for this, thank goodness. Again, you know, we are farmers and real estate agents and nurses and all of these other things. Do know that your government affects you every day, and if you're not watching, we're in trouble. So, you know, we are trying to vote on these things. I am not a fan of jumping the gun. And I think that we had an incident that just scared a few folks that, and again, I'm going to use the word snooping because I don't know the details of the case, nor do I actually care the details of the case, but it came to me as a version of snooping and no harm was done. We have code that already sets it up for if you take something, use something, abuse something, move something, you know, that already exists. So I will say that I don't have the feeling that we're going to start this one again in 19. It may happen. There's a lot of hesitation. The question was asked earlier about why the governor vetoed. And the governor was very wise in the state of Georgia to recognize that, again, your industry stepped up and came out loud. That's what it takes. And so I don't like this bill. I certainly didn't like it when you handed it to me the first day. And there were some changes made. But again, the politics of politics, it got out of the House. And it made it to the governor's desk, and luckily everybody boots on the ground in your industry got that stopped. My thinking is that there's a lot of conversation that needs to happen, and it needs to happen with the right people in the room. And that's not what, apparently, and I'm only guessing here, whenever this started, it didn't start with the right people in the room. And we don't need to be dropping legislation in the state of Georgia that has not been vetted by the industry, which we are about to dramatically affect. So if this happens, if it comes forward, certainly not by me, but if I see this bill, or if anyone is stirring about doing this sort of thing again, we will make sure that there are a lot of people having this conversation with us. And then we get into some of what needs to be vague and what needs to be detailed. And I think we've got good legislation right now that handles the bad guys. So I'm not a fan, and I'll pass it on. Know your House member and your senator, and you call them if you think they're about to do something for you.
Against you, I should say. Building on that, it's really reaching out and truly getting to know the policymakers. And the question goes to you, to the law enforcement side, what do y'all need from an information standpoint as you're going through what information, what voices, what input is helpful for you that you don't necessarily have access to, you don't know what you don't know, but finding ways to get the right people to come in and talk, and part of that is getting the community engaged, getting through EF Georgia, through Technology Association, you know, finding these different interests, and if you're not seeing the input, your viewpoint or your information presented, reach out directly, but getting the information that y'all need to make the decisions that you need to make. Right. Please take help.
So, I'm going to take a different tack, but first I want to make a point about intent. It's worth remembering, as I play historian sometimes because I'm old, that I mentioned the Morris worm before. it was pretty much universally understood that Robert Tappan Morris had no malicious intent, and he was the first person convicted under CFA. Doesn't mean he didn't do any damage. That's why he turned something loose, and they didn't understand how it did that much damage. That's why we have a cert, is because of that. Staff had to do the analysis to figure out how this thing got out of the university. But yeah, there was no malicious intent, and he was convicted. Now, he didn't serve jail time. He had a three-year probation. But I want to flip this around, and so if something happens, I think you can figure out where I come on anti-hacking. I'm opposed to criminals. I'm opposed to people abusing my data. I'm opposed to people not protecting my data, not protecting sensitive information. However, as much as there might be a rationale for the state doing things, I look at the breach disclosure laws and the state laws that, like Massachusetts 201 CMR 17 and 93H. 201 CMR 17 is the breach disclosure law, 93H is basically what you have to do as a business that is in Massachusetts, does businesses there, to protect your data. There are, at last count, 44, 45 states that have breach disclosure laws. No two are identical. As you mentioned earlier, the idea of interstate commerce, we're all everywhere, right? So if something happens, it needs to not be an unreasonable burden on businesses large and small to be able to comply. It doesn't need to be another thing where there are 46 versions of a law. Not that I think we can trust the federal government to get this right either, but I just want to throw that out there. There is a flip side, and I can, believe it or not, actually be sympathetic to businesses trying to defend their system. We've got some real challenges. I think that as it stands, I don't know that I understand the need for it, and last time to pander to law enforcement, whatever we do, it ought to be easy for you to figure out whether or not you should do something. Right? And then it should be easy for you to hand off to a prosecutor. Like, yeah, no, it shouldn't be, well, is this worth my effort?
So, Jack, it's interesting with the 48 different laws, and as flawed as the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act is, Title 18, Section 1030, what do you think of the solution of the state of Georgia just says, if you violate the federal statute, then you can also be prosecuted by Georgia legislators. While it doesn't solve any problems, it seems like a very quick and easy fix to me that that makes it so that the GBI can go in and begin to enforce the existing laws where, while not perfect, it's a known playing field. We know where the lines are. What do you think of that, Jack?
I have enough issues with the CFAA that I wouldn't endorse that.
Okay.
But I do think, as has been mentioned before, if we use the decades-long debates over where there are holes in CFAA, even if we just pick a couple of things, let's find a couple of, but trying to say, hey, there's a really bad federal law, let's enforce it locally too, is not something that I'm really cool with.
It's better than that one.
And we actually have that statute's on the books federally. If there's no federal law, we can actually adopt a state law in the state of the jurisdiction to prosecute under. So, and that happens all the time.
Splits the other way?
Yeah, at Fort Gordon it happens all the time because if it's exclusive federal jurisdiction. If a crime is committed that there's not explicitly a federal law that's been violated, you can adopt the state law for that. And real quick, and I would never argue with Jack Daniels, but I meant to say, probably intent's not the right word. Common sense may be a better word, because intent is, involuntary manslaughter, there's no intent either, but it's still, if somebody goes in there and, and I don't know enough about the code you're talking about, but if somebody goes in there and introduces something and it causes billions of dollars damage, and it wasn't intentional, it doesn't make it not a crime.
It doesn't remove the damage.
Yeah, it doesn't remove the fact that they should be prosecuted, and unfortunately, sometimes good intentions turn into bad results, so that'd be my only comment.
Okay.
So I think we have, 3.5 minutes for some questions. So we're gonna go around and see, I saw a hand there and there's a hand back here, and then and after we do that, I'll come back up here. So you have a question for the man.
Yeah, sorry, I have to pick one of my questions because I have a bunch of thoughts on this, but what I wanted to ask about was activism. News about SB 15 kind of dropped in two waves for me. Local security community, people who understood what it was about and how it would cause issues for them. And then when I started hearing about it at the grocery store was when we had like a wave of activism in regards to people getting frustrated with it and deciding to take things in their own hands to face websites and whatnot. I'm curious, particularly from our state representative, what portion of feedback did you get that was people like him that understood what was going on and how it was going to affect them? And what portion of it was people that were frustrated about the activism? Did that play a part in the law getting, vetoed? I'm just curious.
So I will say I mostly got contacted by people actually through Mark, ended up on your site with all the data. So most of what I got was basically fact-based, fact-driven. Give me something I can work with. And I didn't get the other, but of course, April 30th, after we had ended session and prior to the governor's veto, there was what I guess you're calling activism going on here in Augusta, Georgia, where there was information to a church was taken, the local government came out in the newspaper, and basically there was a message left that said, if you don't, this is about this issue, and SB 315 was mentioned, and the governor needed to stop the bill. That doesn't usually work for me. That's not my favorite way to get information. I would rather you not do it. And so I didn't see a lot of that, hear a lot of that other than reading my local newspaper. But fortunately, prior to, of course, that, I had some very smart people who I had been linked in with that made some changes. It didn't stop. Passed the House and it passed the Senate, and I think more than anything you need to know that it's not a perfect system that we have, and we are a citizen legislature and we all have real jobs at home, and we're trying to make 40 hours a week there and live in Atlanta 3 months. So you need to know that we need you and we need your expertise in any area that affects you directly. After it passed the House, after it passed the Senate and passed the House, which I would not say that this is the best way to do things, but that did not stop. We fought it at the governor's level for the rest of the time. And so we were on it as best we could to get it stopped. Still too many yeses, too many yes votes.
So Adam Savage once said, the only difference between screwing around and science is writing it down. And this is more sort of something to think on, that perhaps like a registry of individuals or institutions that are...
Use the blockchain.
That can detect the intent. No. Maybe, academic institutions, companies that are audited at some point to do this kind of research, rattle the locks, as it were. I could see some shaking heads.
Yeah, all you need to do is go over to the EU and take a look at CREST and what it's done to security research in the European Union, specifically in the UK, and you'll know why that's a bad idea.
I will do that, thank you.
It is an abysmally bad idea.
On a side note, Brian, you want to put your email up there, and all the hackers in the room can send their email to Special Agent Brian Osden, and he'll maintain that.
We got the more intelligent ones over here, so.
Okay. All right. All right. Next question was up here, and who was next up?
So, on the 4th of July, I attended a luncheon for one of the parties, nameless. And a number of the people who were running for office were there to, talk to the people. And I said, okay, you're running for, a position in, Georgia government. How about I help you by looking at your systems and making sure that you're secure? This is free. And I had not a single phone call from these people. A single one. These are people who are not from our industry. And it was alarming to me that no one took me up on a free offer to help protect not just their information, but citizens' information. And so the question I have is, how do we, the industry experts, help people who are not in our field and get their attention? Because they are the people who make our laws. And they're not educated in this area. And we're drill to go and tell them how to keep things safe?
Relationships, positively relationships. When I have a bill that comes through on low voltage electricians, you know, I call the guy in Evans, Georgia that put my speakers in. He owns the company. What does this bill say? You gotta help me out. When I have a cyber question, I've got a contact in my phone right now. But if you don't build those relationships, you know, we don't know who you are. I get hundreds of emails, hundreds. Some of them make no sense at all. I mean, absolutely. And some of them, all they say is vote no. I don't know why. I've tried to get my administrator to ask the question, have you ever read the bill? Most of our bills, like I said, less than 6 pages long. A kindergartner can read the majority of these bills. And but I have people, hundreds of calls a day while we are in this 40-day session of people who have not read the bill. They watch the news. Well, that is not okay. So just build a relationship. And if you're in other states and something like this is going to hit you and you don't have a relationship, you can call me. I will find that relationship with whoever's in your state and tell them what we went through in Georgia and see if we can get somebody to listen. But we don't, admittedly, we can't listen to everyone. You have to have basically almost proven yourself, because there are so many people in front of us every day at the Capitol, at the ropes, every subject matter you can imagine, and I really don't know who's who until you form an intelligent argument, which is how it got to me. It was a very intelligent argument, and it was a really valid bunch of points and stats and data and some historical issues. He commented on some things he'd been through and kind of drew the picture for me on a first grade level. I got it. And then that call went out.
So yeah, going back to keep going back to the thing with intent, right? It seems like the biggest gray area I'm seeing as I'm reading through this is that the only way you can prove malicious intent is if somebody does something malicious, right? You can't just say, I downloaded a database to my computer, but I didn't do anything with it. I just want to see if I can do it, right? You have to prove that somebody did something malicious in order to prove malicious intent. So you have a bill that's essentially there to prevent crime, but you can't enforce it until they actually commit crime. Would you agree with that?
Sorry, we're conferring among the legal minds, but when you start looking at, so Georgia's existing statute, the 16993, it doesn't really get to intent as much as it looks like you took the data. You saw you could get in. You saw you could download the database, and you did. And so it's not whether you intended bad things. You knew you weren't supposed to be doing it. You knew you didn't have access, and you took that information. You kind of took that next step. And so how it gets dealt with from the prosecutors and how that gets interpreted, that's a lot easier to draw a picture, because you can look and say, I don't care why you did it. I don't care, I mean, how you did it is fascinating, because now you can do things, but the fact that you did it was the end result.
But how do you distinguish between research and I just wanted to see if I could? Purpose.
It doesn't.
Right, well, that's what I'm saying. Okay.
But as a researcher, that's part of the responsibility, is understanding, hey, I may be going into a gray area, and knowing what kind of, all right, oops, accidentally did this, all right, now I need to tell somebody, versus getting caught, and that was part of the inspiration behind 315. The researchers did come forward and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't have gotten into where we got into and access to what we got access to. Somebody needs to fix this. And so a firestorm, because it's embarrassing, because we'd already been embarrassed from several other elections issues.
Okay. So I want to thank the panel. This is a really complex issue, and I'm glad that we solved it here today.
What is the solution?
Yeah, it was laws, more laws. Yeah. So before we take off here, I want to thank all my panelists, thank everybody for coming out here. But Scott, there's something going on here in the next legislature. You guys have some watch going on or something like that. I just want to give you an opportunity to tell everybody about it.
Okay. So for those people who'd like to get involved and wondering what the next step is, Electronic Frontiers Georgia, we did not do this the past year, and this is one of the things that slipped by us, but coming up for the next session, we're going to do Legislative Review Committee, and that means that in February and March, we're going to meet every single week and talk about technology legislation and see where we can have an impact and see where we can have a comment period. And we can't always fix every problem that comes down, but we can come in and kind of give our input. So last year, we weren't looking on a regular basis, and this kind of caught us by surprise. This was passed in the Senate committee on January 31st, which is extremely early for any bill to pass committee. And I was on January 31st, or I think on February 1st, I was looking up to see when this bill would come before committee so I could go out and speak against it. And it had already passed on January 31st. And there was nobody speaking against it. It was just the Attorney General's office asking for this bill. So we don't want to get caught by surprise. We want to meet twice in January, then every week in February and March. These will be virtual meetings. They'll be on the, with internet conferencing. And we would love to have more representation throughout Georgia, not just in the Atlanta area, because we're mostly Atlanta-based now, but if somebody's in Augusta or somewhere else in the state, we'd love to have some other people on those calls who could do some of this. If you've got an internet connection, you can go to the state's website and look up this legislation, and you can be a part of this. So if you'd like to get involved, please let me know. Thanks.
Thank you. All right, and thank you once again to, can I get one more round of applause for everyone?